The Russo-Japanese War was fought between Japan and Russia in the early 20th century. In the previous article, I explained how the Baltic Fleet appeared in the Tsushima Strait. This time, I would like to explain the actual battle. Russo-Japanese was thinking only of reaching Vladivostok safely anyway. He knew that he was no match for the elite Russian fleet, which had been defeated by the Allied fleet. However, the Allied fleet had read their coming course perfectly. As explained in the previous video, the Baltic Fleet's shape was disrupted by contact with the destroyer force for reconnaissance purposes. Thus, they ended up in an awkward double-column formation. And before they could correct their formation, Togo's combined fleet appeared. The battlefield was near Okinoshima Island in the Tsushima Strait. Russo-Japanese decided to fight as it was. Comparing the number of battleships, the Baltic Fleet had 8 battleships and the Allied fleet had 4 battleships. In terms of the number of main ships alone, the Baltic Fleet was overwhelming. However, the number of cruisers and destroyers was greater in the Allied fleet. Togo's combined fleet formed a single column and gradually closed the distance from the Baltic Fleet's front. At 13:55 on May 27, the distance between the two fleets approached 13,000 meters. And at 14:05, the flagship Mikasa with Togo on board, the leader of the Allied fleet, changed course right in front of the enemy and tried to block the Baltic Fleet's direction of movement. This made Russo-Japanese doubt his eyes, and he muttered to himself that Togo had lost his mind. Warships are most easily attacked when they are changing direction. When changing course, a warship must slow down, making it appear to the enemy that it is standing still. Therefore, it was impossible in the common sense of the Navy at that time to make a large right-angle turn within the range of the enemy. Naturally, Togo knew this. Togo had learned a bitter lesson from the previous battle of the Yellow Sea. Togo tried to attack the enemy from the side of the enemy's direction of movement to intercept them in order to take the T-shaped strategy. However, the Russian fleet changed its direction of travel to avoid this. Because of this, Togo almost lost sight of the enemy. Learning from this lesson, Togo chose to take the risk of entering an attack position in front of the enemy and destroying them, even at the cost of his own life. As Togo's rotational movement began, Russo-Japanese seized the opportunity and began to fire. The distance was 7,000 meters. Togo and Chief of Staff Yuzaburo Kato took command from a vantage point on the bridge while the ship was being bombarded. He determined the chain of command after his fall, while the spectator military officers and Chief of Staff, Akiyama, watched the progress of the battle from a relatively safe location. How much the morale of the crew of the Mikasa must have been boosted by the sight of Togo commanding from the best vantage point. The Baltic Fleet's bombardment technology was poor, and it was not easy for shells to hit the Mikasa. Even so, Togo's flagship Mikasa took the most shells of any ship in the combined fleet. Togo's fleet followed Mikasa and changed direction one after another. While the Baltic Fleet opened fire, Togo did not give the signal to open fire. At 14:10, when the distance between the fleets approached 6,400 meters, Togo ordered the first bombardment. Then, the ships began to open fire on the Baltic Fleet from the battleships that had finished changing direction. And when all the ships had finished changing direction, the T-formation was complete. The Allied fleet opened up a concentrated fire on the enemy flagship Nizhitsuvara. Russo-Japanese avoided the T-maneuver and chose to run alongside the Allied fleet to exchange shells with it. Osliabia, which was sailing behind the flagship, came under concentrated fire and left the line of fire early. The Baltic Fleet responded violently, and in the first 20 minutes of the battle, the two ships engaged in a fierce exchange of shells, which damaged the Mikasa. However, the Baltic Fleet was losing combat capability at a tremendous rate as it was met with accurate fire from the Allied fleet. This also affected the shells released by the Allied fleet. Normally, artillery shells are intended to penetrate and sink enemy battleships. However, The Shimose gunpowder used in the shells used by the Allied fleet was focused on killing and wounding combatants on the enemy deck and taking away their ability to fight. Shimose gunpowder is pure picric acid, which generates high heat and explodes when it comes into contact with iron. Even if the Japanese shells did not hit the enemy ship, they generated high heat and exploded simply when the shells made contact with the surface of the water. To create this sensitive shell, the Owen fuse was introduced. This fuse was so sensitive that it exploded at the slightest provocation. This sensitive fuse was also very dangerous to use and caused many mishaps during the Battle of the Sea of Japan. However, even ignoring the safety hazard, the Navy used this bomb. In the words of his Chief of Staff, Seiyuki Akiyama, the game was won in 30 minutes. All that remained was the battle of pursuit. The enemy flagship Nizhny Suvorov was hit by a shell and immediately lost navigation. The captain of the second ship, Imperator Alexander III, decided that the flagship had become unseaworthy and took the lead himself, leading the following ships. However, Imperator Alexander III also came under intensive fire and left the line of battle. At 14:55, the lead battleship Borodino attempted to slip past Togo and head for Vladivostok. For a time, the Baltic Fleet succeeded in shaking off the Allied fleet. At 15:55, however, the Allied fleet spotted the Baltic Fleet heading north at 7,000 meters, and at 16:01, after approaching 6,500 meters, opened fire again. The flagship Nizhny Suvorov was once again disabled and meandered. Roshestvensky suffered a head wound and relinquished commands to his subordinates. After this, Roshestvensky and his officers abandoned the flagship and moved to a destroyer. At 1920, the Allied fleet ended its bombardment and the day's fighting was over. Most of the main battleships were sunk in the battle. On the 28th, the Allied fleet continued its operation to clear the remaining Baltic fleet. The Baltic fleet lost most of its ships in this sweep. The destroyer with Roshestvensky on board then headed for Vladivostok, but was discovered by a destroyer of the Allied fleet and surrendered, unable to shake off the enemy. The enemy General Roshestvensky was taken prisoner by the Japanese. A look at the damage sustained by both sides in the Battle of the Sea of Japan shows that the Baltic Fleet lost 21 ships, 6 were captured, and 6 were interned by neutral nations. The number of casualties was 4,830 killed and 6,106 prisoners of war. The Allied fleet lost 3 minesweepers, 157 men killed and 583 wounded. It was a one-sided victory, rare in the history of fleet battles between large fleets. Haichiro Togo later went to visit Roshestvensky, who was hospitalized for an injury. He visited Roshestvensky without his military uniform and in a white shirt. Sitting in a chair so as not to look down on him, Togo, who was known for his extreme reticence, is said to have spoken in a manner so prolific that even his subordinates were surprised. Togo said, "I am a sailor and I know how hard you have sailed. Unfortunately, you lost the battle, but I consider your achievements to be great." Roshestvensky said he wept, "My greatest consolation is that I was defeated by the admiral." This naval battle decided the course of the Russo-Japanese War. The Tsar of Russia heard the news and realized that he had no choice but to cease the war. The Japanese forces no longer had the strength to continue the war. Next time I will explain the Posmatch Treaty. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe to the channel and press the like button.